Thanks very much, Mon, and thanks for the opportunity to present this work, and to all of you for coming along to listen to it. So I'm going to talk about our research up in Edinburgh on multimorbidity and place. And I guess first of all, just to put this into the context of the broader project. So this is part of the AIM-CISC project, which stands for Artificial Intelligence and Multimorbidity, Clustering in Individuals, Space and Clinical Context. So this is a large project based up at the University of Edinburgh with 4 objectives. And I'm going to talk about the objective here in green, which is about the clustering of multiple long-term conditions in communities and places. So this is a really large project. And even within each of these objectives, there are teams of people who are working. So each of these objectives is very interdisciplinary. We're using diverse data, diverse methods. We have patient and public involvement and engagement built into these programs of research. And I guess in a broader sense, this project sits within the Advanced Care Research Centre, which is led by Bruce Guthrie, which has as its aim a kind of ambition to promote interdisciplinary and collaborative research around ageing and care. So I'm going to share all of the slides afterwards, and there are links to these various projects that you can see to get more information on them. So let me just start off with a bit of context. So multimorbidity refers to living with one or more chronic health condition, and it's a really important social issue, partly because the numbers of people living with multimorbidity are growing, partly driven by people living longer and population aging. But it's also important because it has a really significant impact on individuals' quality of life, particularly where conditions interact with each other to result in worse outcomes than if people had these conditions individually. And it's a really difficult thing to manage, because often if we're trying to treat, for example, one health condition, for example, the medicines that are used to treat that can interact with medicines to treat other conditions and have kind of adverse effects as a result. And thinking about this aging population, multimorbidity is a really important issue because it's the norm rather than the exception for older adults, and many people are living with more than one chronic health condition. So why is place important? Well, in Scotland, we can see the effect of place really strongly, and also in the rest of the UK. But in Scotland, research has shown that people in the most deprived neighbourhoods develop multimorbidity around 10 to 15 years earlier than in the richest neighbourhoods. And what I think is particularly important is that this effect, or this difference between the most affluent and the least affluent neighbourhoods persists even when we control for individual circumstances like the jobs people do, the wealth they have, the housing they live in. So we still see this effect, this difference between neighbourhoods when we control for things that predict both multimorbidity but also predict the kind of place that you live in. So there's a strong steer here from the research that the characteristics of a place where people live is also important in terms of influencing health outcomes like multimorbidity. And I've put a reference here from George Golster, who's thought quite carefully about the many pathways through which place can affect health outcomes. So the research gap that I'm going to focus on in this presentation is that we know from existing studies that material deprivation is associated with health outcomes like multimorbidity, but less is known about the social features of a place. So these are things like what people think about the place that they live in, the levels of social cohesion within a neighbourhood, because clearly a place can be deprived, but nonetheless it can be a place that people value a great deal in terms of a place to live. Existing studies have not really investigated in detail what features of deprived neighbourhoods are driving increased levels of multimorbidity. So many papers will include a measure of deprivation for a place, and they will associate that with a health outcome like multimorbidity, but the pathways that underpin that association are less investigated. And then in the second half of the presentation, I'm going to talk about a gap in the data that we have on neighbourhoods, which our research is trying to address. And this is that many of these social aspects of place, so things like what people think about a neighbourhood, the reputation of that neighbourhood, the degree of community resources or the level of antisocial behaviour within a place, are not well captured in the data that we have on neighbourhoods. So I'm going to show you a really quite innovative approach that we've trialed to try and deal with this gap in literature. So here are the three research questions. First of all, does multimorbidity risk vary with neighbourhood social context? What features of neighbourhood attenuate this well-known association we see between area deprivation and multimorbidity risk? And then finally, can we extract themes from local newspapers to capture these aspects of neighbourhood social context? So the first part of the research is using a social survey, a longitudinal social survey in the UK called the UK Household Longitudinal Study. It's also known as Understanding Society. And here we have a sample of 15,000 adults who are followed over time. And from this, we can extract a whole set of individual level variables. So we have an indicator for multimorbidity, and this is based on self-report of 25 chronic conditions. So whether people are classed as multimorbid if they have two or more of those conditions. We also have information on demographics, people's age, their gender. We have a whole set of information on people's social circumstances. So that includes things like their education levels through qualifications, their income, and also the kind of occupation they do, which we put on a scale going from professional occupations down to unskilled occupations. We have detailed information on health behaviours, so things like alcohol consumption, physical activity, fruit and vegetable consumption, and smoking. And crucially, a really valuable thing with this data set is we have a measure of people's perceptions of the neighbourhood social context or the neighbourhood social cohesion. And we use here a measure that's been validated in the literature, Buckner's cohesion scale. And this is based on a set of 8 questions where people are asked things like, do you feel like you belong to your neighbourhood? Do you feel like you could trust your neighbours? Would you be willing to invest your time in community activities within that neighbourhood? And we also have information on whether people feel or self-report as feeling lonely. And we include that in our models, partly because we think that it may be a pathway through which neighbourhood cohesion operates in terms of influencing multimorbidity, and we want to try and test that. So we have this individual level survey data, and we were able to link that survey data based on where people lived to a whole set of information about the neighbourhoods that they lived in. And here we're using a kind of geographical boundary called a middle super output area. So this is a standard statistical area for output that's used by people like the Office for National Statistics. And to give you a sense of the size of these areas, they have an average population of around 8,000 people. So we had a whole set of characteristics about neighbourhoods. First of all, in terms of material deprivation, we had from the Index of Multiple Deprivation a measure of the income deprivation in a place. So this is the proportion of people who are experiencing income poverty. And then we had a set of what I'm going to refer to as physical features of the neighbourhood. So we had a measure of green-blue space. So this is access to green space or access to a body of water, so a coast or a lake. And that's determined partly by satellite imagery, but also by the distance which people have to travel to get to these spaces. We had information on the retail environment in the neighbourhood, so the prevalence of fast food outlets, pubs, bars, tobacconists, off licenses and gambling. So the extent to which that neighbourhood might promote unhealthy behaviours in relation to those factors. And we also had information on air pollution. So these 3 aspects of the physical environment in a neighbourhood are developed by the Consumer Data Research Centre. So you can download these, and it's from their access to healthy assets and hazards data set. So in terms of the methods, we started off with some cross-sectional analysis. So we fitted a logistic regression of the odds of being multimorbid, having multimorbidity. In our first model, we just included the level of neighbourhood deprivation, people's individual social and economic circumstances, and their demographic factors. Then in model 2, we added in physical aspects of the neighbourhood. Then we added in the social aspects of the neighbourhood, so what people think about their neighbourhood. We then added in health behaviours, and then we added in our loneliness controls. And what we were really interested in doing here is, first of all, looking at the effect of neighbourhood social cohesion. Is that associated with multimorbidity? And then we were also interested in whether the association between neighbourhood deprivation and multimorbidity was attenuated or became less as we controlled for other factors, which might suggest that neighbourhood deprivation is actually acting through some of these other features of the neighbourhood. We also did some longitudinal analysis, and that's because we were mindful that we wanted to check that our associations that were observed cross-sectionally were robust to reverse causation. So we wanted to check that by selecting a subsample of 5,000 people who were healthy at the start of the study, so in wave 1 of the survey, and we looked at the logistic regression of odds of developing multimorbidity over a 9-year period. So, we were concerned with this idea that deprivation might be associated with multimorbidity, but it could be that people who have multimorbidity are selected into deprived places, so that the association could run in both directions, and we wanted to just guard against making false claims in relation to that. Okay, so let me go over some findings. So first of all, thinking about neighbourhood social cohesion, we found there were significant differences in multimorbidity risk according to this variable in terms of what people think about their neighbourhood. So those who had the highest perceptions of neighbourhood cohesion had odds of being multimorbid that were 30% smaller than those with the lowest perceptions of their neighbourhood. And that's controlling for other things like their demographics, their social characteristics on an individual level, their health behaviours, and the other neighbourhood features. But what was really interesting, I think, in our results is once we included loneliness in our model, the association between neighbourhood social cohesion and multimorbidity was no longer significant. And really, we felt that one conclusion from this, or one possibility that this suggests, is that the association between neighbourhood social cohesion and multimorbidity is acting partly through possibly loneliness. So those people who are in areas that they don't value their neighbourhood are more likely to be lonely, and loneliness is what is then associated with multimorbidity. We also found that including neighbourhood cohesion in our models didn't affect the association between neighbourhood deprivation and multimorbidity. And again, a possible conclusion here is that the material deprivation and the social features of neighbourhood may be acting on health independently. So you may live in a deprived area, but if you also view that area negatively, then that's a kind of double disadvantage in terms of risks of multimorbidity. Here are our main findings in relation to deprivation. So here we have a graph with age along the horizontal axis and the predicted probability of multimorbidity on the vertical axis. And there are two lines here. The top line is for people who are in the most deprived areas, and the bottom line is for the people who are in the least deprived areas. And we can see a big differential here. Individuals in the most deprived areas were almost 1.5 times more likely to be multimorbid than individuals in the least deprived neighbourhoods, even when controlling for all of the other things in our model. And a really stark observation from this graph is that around the age of 60, those in the most deprived areas would have the same probability of being multimorbid compared to an 82-year-old in the most affluent areas, even after controlling for these other potential confounders. In terms of the physical features of neighbourhoods, of these, it was only the access to green and blue space that had a significant effect. So we found that each standard deviation increase in our measure of access to green and blue space was associated with around a 14% reduction in odds of being multimorbid. We didn't find any association between air pollution and the local retail environment and multimorbidity. And crucially, including these physical neighbourhood features didn't attenuate the effect of neighbourhood deprivation on multimorbidity, suggesting they're kind of acting independently. So here's a graph just to look at how the association between neighbourhood deprivation and multimorbidity changed across our models. And I guess the key finding here is that the most substantial attenuation in the link between neighbourhood deprivation and multimorbidity was after we included health behaviours. So just to talk about the graph here, along the horizontal axis, I've got the 5 different models we fitted. On the vertical axis, I've got the predicted probability. And you can see here a kind of gradient in these predicted probabilities going from quite low probabilities to higher probabilities. And this gradient is going from the least deprived neighbourhoods, which have the lowest probability of multimorbidity, to the most deprived neighbourhoods, which have the highest probability of multimorbidity. So you can see in the first model, which only included demographics and people's individual social and economic circumstances, the ranges from about a probability of about 0.1 or 10% to about 0.18 or 175 in the most deprived places, so about a 7.5% gap. So you can see in the first model, we just have demographics and people's individual social and economic circumstances. In the second model along, we add physical neighbourhood features, and you can see that has very little effect on this gradient of increasing risk across the scale of deprivation across neighbourhoods. And then in the third model, we add neighbourhood social cohesion. And again, you can see that the predicted probabilities and the gradient in those is largely unaffected. In the fourth model, you can see that this gradient is reduced. And here we are adding in health behaviours. So health behaviours is reducing the gradient of risk in multimorbidity according to neighbourhood deprivation. And then in the final model, we've added loneliness, and there isn't really any further attenuation in that social gradient in multimorbidity risk. So I mentioned that we were also going to do some longitudinal analysis, and I'll just summarise that briefly to say that the main findings were broadly confirmed. So we started off here with healthy individuals, and we looked at people who developed multimorbidity. We found that those in the most deprived neighbourhoods had twice the odds of developing multimorbidity. Those with the highest perceptions of neighbourhood cohesion had half the odds of going on to develop multimorbidity compared to those with the lowest perception of their neighbourhood. We did have quite small numbers here, so we were less able to fit complex models. We had larger confidence intervals as a result, but it did seem to be the case that the broad findings were confirmed. So I guess a key outcome of this research is that we know that material deprivation in places is important for health outcomes like multimorbidity, but it appears too that social dimensions of place, what people think about their neighbourhood, are also important for risks of multimorbidity. And this really points to a gap in the data we have about places. So this information on social features of neighbourhoods isn't generally available in the neighbourhood statistical output that we have. And a key aim of the AIM-CISC project was to try and address this gap in the data that we have available to us. And so we sought to answer this question, which is, can we capture the social dimensions of place using themes that occur in local newspaper text? So this is possibly the part of the project that was really interdisciplinary. So this was a collaboration with colleagues over in informatics, as well as health geographers and social statisticians, and also people involved in clinical practice. And I'll talk about the people involved at the end of the presentation. So essentially what we did here is we used natural language processing to extract and analyse text from local online newspapers in Edinburgh. So we accessed over 60,000 unique articles between 2017 and 2022. And we used a geoparser to allocate articles to neighbourhoods based on place names within those articles. And then we use topic modelling to look for clusters in the words used within newspapers to identify around 50 themes that were using words that were connected in some way. So we classified each of these articles to a particular theme, and then we were able to calculate the intensity of each theme across Edinburgh neighbourhoods. And then we were interested in validating this, and we thought about two particular ways to do this. First is the intensity of those themes associated with domains of the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation in reasonable ways. And then secondly, do theoretically relevant newspaper themes predict neighbourhood resilience and vulnerability in plausible ways? And I'll say a bit more what I mean about resilience and vulnerability in a later slide. So here's a slide showing the process. You can see we extracted some articles, local newspaper articles, as shown on the left of the slide. We then used NLP techniques to identify the location to which these articles referred to. So that could be based on an area name. It could be based on a road or a park that was mentioned within those articles. And then we were able to assign these articles to data zones as a result. Data zones are a geographical boundary which have a population of around 700. So we were also able to run cluster analysis on the text from the newspaper articles to identify particular themes. And then we were able to characterize those themes by looking at the word clouds and deciding what the clusters represented. And we were able to link, obviously, these clusters to particular places and work out the intensity within which particular themes co-occurred with particular places. And this is a part of the methodology that was really useful to involve our public and patient and public involvement and engagement group in this. So these are some of the word clouds that we got out of the analysis of the text data from newspapers. And we involved our PPIE group in this, and we talked to them about what they think the clusters were representing, which we used to help name these clusters. But we also talked to them about which clusters they felt might be important to understanding how a characteristic of a place might affect a health outcome. So we had around 50 clusters in total, and from these we extracted clusters that we felt were theoretically relevant for understanding the link between neighbourhood and health. And so I'm going to show you some of the themes that we picked. So this is one theme which we called heritage and tourism. And so you can see here words like tourist, historic, buildings, visitors. So we called this particular word cloud heritage and tourism, and we thought it had a theoretical link to health outcomes in the literature, so we included it in our modelling. Here are a couple of word clouds which are linked to the property market. So we thought that the vibrancy of the property market would indicate the attractiveness of a place to live, so might get at the reputation of a particular neighbourhood. And you can see words here like house prices, properties, spacious, dining room, market, which indicate the individual words that led us to naming these word clouds in this way. We also looked at more negative aspects or negative clusters. So this is a word cloud which is we call littering and antisocial problems. So it's capturing things like fly tipping, rubbish, problem, issues, complaint, waste, and so on. This was quite an interesting word cloud, which was linked, all was linked to boxing. So you can see here words like opponent, fighter, lightweight, and there are also names here which are boxers who are linked to particular Edinburgh boxing clubs who have had successes in the ring over time. And so we really included this cluster in our analysis because we thought it would show a capacity within a neighbourhood to sustain a community club. And it might be a club that people in the area derive a local identity or reputation or sense of pride in their place through this activity. But clearly this relates to boxing, but you could imagine it could relate to football or other forms of support or community activity. We had quite a few, as you might expect, quite a few word clouds linked to crime, and we were actually able to divide these into different forms of articles on crime. So we called this one unsolved crime. So it includes things like suspect, asking for people to come forward, anonymous report, trying to trace somebody, asking for information, asking for being assisted in inquiries. And we contrasted that with managed crime, which was more about the process of sentencing. So we saw here words like prison, court, jailed, pleaded guilty, and so on. So the first thing we did is we wanted to see how do these newspaper themes relate to things that are measured about places in the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. So the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation captures the level of deprivation in data zones or neighbourhoods in Scotland according to various different themes. So this includes income, employment, health, education, access, crime, and housing. And you can see all of those listed along the bottom of the correlation chart that I've shown here. On the vertical part of this chart, you can see some of the themes that we extracted from the local newspapers. And I guess the key point to say here is that the associations we found between newspaper themes and the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation were largely quite plausible. So, for example, we found that our indicators of crime were positively associated with domains of the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. So where our newspaper themes on crime increased in a place, then deprivation tended to increase. And then if we look at property adverts, we found that as property adverts in a particular place increased, then the level of deprivation decreased. So I think we'd expect to see the association in that direction. So it gave us some confidence that our newspaper themes were capturing things in the ways we might expect. But what we were really interested in assessing is, are our newspapers' themes telling us things we don't know about in the Index of Multiple Deprivation? And are they helping us to understand health outcomes in addition to what we might know from the level of deprivation in the area? And in order to investigate this, we developed a measure of vulnerability and resilience in neighbourhoods. And the graph on the left shows you how we produced this. So essentially, along the horizontal axis, we've got the deprivation score. And along the vertical axis, we've got a measure of poor health in those neighbourhoods. So the higher up the scale, the poorer the health. And each of these blue dots is a neighbourhood within Edinburgh. And the red dotted line shows this expected relationship of, as deprivation increases, so too does the level of poor health also increases in those neighbourhoods. Now, any of the neighbourhoods above the red line are vulnerable neighbourhoods. So they have poorer health outcomes than we'd expect given the deprivation in them. And the neighbourhoods below the dotted red line are resilient neighbourhoods. So these are neighbourhoods that have better health outcomes than the level of deprivation would suggest. So we calculated a measure of vulnerability and resilience for each neighbourhood. And we were interested in saying, do any of our newspaper themes predict vulnerability and resilience in neighbourhoods? So do they predict the health outcomes after we've controlled for deprivation? So here are some of the results. So first of all, thinking about heritage. So we were interested, is the intensity of newspaper articles on heritage within a particular neighbourhood associated with vulnerability and resilience? And there are two charts here. So on the left, we have the most resilient neighbourhoods in terms of being in the top 10%. And on the right, we have the most vulnerable neighbourhoods in terms of being in the top 10% for vulnerability. And then along the horizontal axis, we're going from the least deprived neighbourhood to the most deprived neighbourhood. And then on the vertical axis, we have the percentage of articles on heritage. And what you can see here is that the most resilient neighbourhoods have in common a tendency to also have higher percentages of articles on heritage. So you can see that a number of these neighbourhoods have over 2.5% of the articles on heritage, which is never really the case for vulnerable neighbourhoods. So this is suggesting that perhaps we can understand resilience and vulnerability through the use of this heritage variable, at least in terms of an association. How about antisocial behaviour? Well, we see a similar kind of intuitive and plausible result here. So again, the resilient neighbourhoods on the left tend to have not have high percentages of articles on littering and antisocial behaviour, whereas in contrast, the vulnerable neighbourhoods do tend to see high percentages of newspaper articles on this kind of low-level antisocial behaviour. So we fitted a model to predict neighbourhood resilience and vulnerability using our various NLP themes. And what we observed is that resilience appeared to be associated with increases in local press on themes of heritage in terms of boxing and managed crime, whereas vulnerability was associated with increases in local press themes around littering and antisocial behaviour, unsolved crime, and also local politics. So I think a plausibility in our results there, which is encouraging. So this is very much work in process. We're kind of assessing the sensitivity of these results to different scales, but we do have some encouragement to suggest that we are picking up meaningful things in this natural language processing of local media data that is perhaps helpful to understand health outcomes after controlling for deprivation. So I'll finish off with some conclusions. So first of all, from the first part of the presentation, I think our research is confirming these stark inequalities in multimorbidity by neighbourhood deprivation, but these don't appear to be attenuated by the physical aspects of place, such as the retail environment, access to green and blue space, and pollution, air pollution. The main attenuation is really after controlling for health behaviours. So it may be that certain places encourage particular lifestyle choices, cultures develop around particular health behaviours in those places, and I think some more research is needed to try and understand the nature of the association there. We find that neighbourhood social context, so what people think about the places that they live in, is associated with multimorbidity, and that this acts independently to area deprivation and other individual risk factors, and it does seem that loneliness is one plausible pathway through which this association operates. And then finally, this emerging research that we're working on suggests that using natural language processing techniques to analyse local newspaper text has real promise for capturing social aspects of place that are neglected in area measures like the Index of Multiple Deprivation and other area-based statistics that we have. So I'm presenting here a lot of research, really interdisciplinary in nature, and it's certainly not work that I've done on my own. So this is a collaboration between colleagues in social statistics, geography, particularly informatics for all of the work and the technique around natural language processing, and also clinical colleagues. And I should really identify here Bialix and Andreas Grivas, who've led a lot of the work on the natural language processing, Eliojo Abubakar, who's also done some of the work on the newspaper profiling of places, and Lawrence Rowley Abel, who has undertaken the research using understanding society, so the survey analysis. So I will finish there.